The Roman Empire never fell. And if it hadn't, if the center had held, if the idea had survived every plague and every war and every crack in the foundation, where would Rome have gone next? Not into decline, not into memory, into space. This is the story of an empire that never stopped building, that turned its aqueducts into rocket fuel, that sent its legions past the atmosphere and planted SPQR in the dust of the moon. This is Provincia Lunae, and this is what Rome looked like when it never ended. In another world, everything you know never happened. This is that world. Welcome to Take Two. For centuries, the engineers had looked up. Not with wonder, exactly. Romans were not given to wonder in the way poets were. They looked up the way they looked at a river, calculating the distance, measuring the current, asking how much pressure it would take to move water from one place to another. The moon was a problem to be solved. It had always been there. It had pulled the tides and marked the calendar and been named and renamed by every civilization that came before. But Rome was the first to ask, in a language of bronze and water and pressure and force, how to get there. The answer took 300 years. It began in the shipyards of Ostia, not in the temples, not in the Senate. It began where Roman power had always begun, in the hands of men who worked with tools, engineers who had learned to move mountains of water across valleys and mountains of stone across continents. Men who understood that the distance between impossible and merely difficult was usually a matter of time and pressure. The first prototypes failed, spectacularly, repeatedly, and in ways that left scorch marks on the stone piers that are still visible today. The boilers burst. The pressure valves gave way. Steam, it turned out, had opinions of its own. But Rome had something that steam did not: patience. The test flights began in the early hours, always before dawn, when the harbor was quiet and the air was cold and the steam rose clean against the dark sky. Small crews, leather suits stitched tighter than any armor, helmets of bronze with glass ground so fine it was nearly invisible, fitted with copper tubes that fed air from cylinders on their backs, cool and pressurized and just enough. The first men to leave the ground were not celebrated, not immediately. Rome was practical. You did not celebrate a thing until it worked. It worked. The crossing took time that no Roman calendar had a word for. Inside the ships, galleons of oak and brass, their hulls reinforced against a cold that no legionary had ever trained for. The men slept in hammocks and repaired leaking valves and ate hard bread and watched through thick glass viewports as the earth grew smaller behind them. It did not comfort them, exactly, but it did not frighten them either. Romans had always moved toward the horizon. The horizon had simply moved further away. They played dice. They sharpened their swords out of habit, though there was nothing to fight. They argued about rations and complained about the officers the way soldiers had complained about officers since the beginning of Rome. And in the quiet hours, when the ship was still and the stars were very close, and the earth was a blue circle smaller than a coin held at arm's length, some of them wrote letters they knew would take months to arrive. The moon grew larger in the viewports, gray, enormous, entirely silent. And then the thrusters fired, and the descent began. The first footprint in lunar dust was made by a soldier from Hispania. His name was recorded. His unit was recorded. The pressure in his oxygen cylinder at the moment of first contact was recorded, because Rome recorded everything. What was not recorded, what could not be recorded, was what he felt. He stood on a surface that no living thing had ever stood on. The earth hung above him, impossibly blue, impossibly far, impossibly present. He could see the coastlines. He could almost, if he allowed himself, imagine the harbor at Ostia, the smell of salt water and hot metal and bread from the market stalls near the docks. He planted the standard, SPQR, the Senate and the people of Rome, on the moon. What followed was not conquest in the old sense. There was nothing to conquer. The moon offered no resistance, only distance and cold, and a silence so complete that men who had lived their entire lives surrounded by the noise of cities found it difficult to breathe, even when the oxygen tanks were full. What followed was something Rome had always done better than anyone else. Construction. Stone cut from the lunar surface itself. Walls raised in the ancient pattern, the same pattern that had built the roads of Gaul and the bridges of Britannia and the aqueducts that still carry water across the hills of Italy. The same mathematics, the same ratios, the same careful attention to what lasts. Castrum Lunae, the lunar fort. It was small at first, a ring of basalt walls around a pressurized core, cold corridors, copper pipes that ran too hot in some places and not hot enough in others, air that tasted faintly of metal and oil, and something no one could name. Home, eventually. The city came later. It always does. Where soldiers go, traders follow. Where traders go, builders follow. Where builders go, families follow. And where families go, everything that makes a civilization follows with them. The arguments and the music, and the children playing games no one had invented yet, and the old men sitting in the late afternoon talking about places they had left behind. Provincia Lunae. Under the great dome of glass and iron, a Roman city breathed. Not the Rome of marble and crowds and 1,000 years of accumulated noise. Something quieter, something built from scratch, without the weight of history pressing down on every stone. They built theaters, they built libraries, they built fountains, and the water moved in low gravity in long, slow arcs that no fountain on earth had ever made, and children stood watching it for hours. They built a temple to Jupiter on the rim of a crater, and the priests stood in their ceremonial armor and looked up at the sky and conducted the old rites, and the earth looked down on all of it, enormous and blue and indifferent and beautiful. In the Senate halls on earth, men debated the governance of a province that no senator had ever visited. New laws were written for situations no law had anticipated. What did it mean to be a Roman citizen born on the moon? What was the status of a man who had never touched earth soil? The questions were difficult. Rome answered them the way Rome always answered difficult questions, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous amounts of paperwork, but it answered them. The mines came next, deep cuts into the lunar surface, steam engines pulling up metals that Earth did not have in the quantities Rome now needed. The industrial machinery of an empire that had never stopped growing, now fed by resources from another world entirely. The ships grew larger. The routes became regular. Supply chains stretched across the void the way roads had once stretched across continents. Maintained, organized, mapped, defended. The expeditions to Mars began almost quietly. There was no single moment of decision, no proclamation, no triumph in the forum. There was simply a morning when the launch pad on the lunar surface was prepared, and a crew boarded a ship larger than any that had come before, and the steam thrusters fired, and the ship rose, and turned and moved toward a red point of light in the black sky. Rome had always moved toward the horizon. The horizon, once again, had simply moved. Subscribe, like, and comment, because there are infinite other versions waiting for you. The next Take 2 drops soon.